Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of class webinars from the Sandy Granite Family Search Center. And it's our pleasure tonight to have as our presenter a person who has presented for us before, Miles Meyer, who is touting his 78-degree weather where he is in Florida. And if you'd like, he'll send you some free suntan lotion. So if it's like here where it's 2 degrees, we could use it for insulation or whatnot. But it's great to have Miles with us again tonight. Miles is the director of his local family search center. And he's also the education director for the Family History Guide. And he does a lot of other things as well. He's got I think 20 fingers on each hand, and they're all buried in some kind of a project or another. So, but he's a busy guy and a lot of fun. And his title tonight is Adding Social History to Your Family History, I think, which will be interesting and fun for us. So before I turn Miles loose on us, this particular webinar will be up in a few days, and you can see it. I'll put the link to it, to the Granite Family History Center on the chat. And if you have questions, you can ask those when Miles is finished tonight, or you can put them on the chat and we will get to them either way. So Miles, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and glad to be here tonight. This is a new talk for me. This is the first time I've presented this talk, and so if you have any comments about it, anything you think I've missed, let me know, and we'll add those for the next time I give this talk. But we are talking about social history and adding that to our family history projects. And so when we talk about the historical context of family history, this is a quote from 1957 in the NGS Quarterly. It says, "The study of genealogy is something larger than the particular genealogy itself. It is the history of a family in both its immediate relationship and its wider impacts on society. When the genealogist interprets his lineage of begats and begottens with perspective and presents it in a forceful literary style, he begins to delve into the meaning of the past and earn the richer rewards of historical genealogy." Like I said, this is from 1957. So this is, 65 years ago. And we tend to think today of adding history to our genealogy as something fairly new, but the concept's been around for a while. And we may think of history as that boring class we took in high school. You know, we took American history and European history and whatever other histories that we took. But when we talk about adding it to our genealogy research, we help to bring our ancestors' stories to life. So, what is family history to you? Is it a collection of names and dates? Is it how many ancestors you can collect? People are always like, hey, I've got 12,000 names in my tree. Well, I've got 30,000 in my tree. Is it just a dusty facts? Is it the research on your brick wall? Well, how can you make family history exciting and interesting for your whole family? When we talk about social history, we have to distinguish that from history itself, because history generally focuses on those lives of the important people and events and how they influence the world. But when we talk about social history, it focuses on the lives of the ordinary people, and it ties the history to our ancestors. Things like how people made their living, how they raised their children, what a household looked like, how world and local events affected their lives, why they settled in an area, and were they in the military, are all components of their social history. So why is social history important? Well, in order to understand our ancestors, we need to understand how their lives and decisions were affected by the events of their lifetimes. It gives us a better insight into our ancestors and helps us to know our ancestors more intimately. And it could help us find records that we wouldn't have thought about previously. And it's more than just the who, the when, and the where that we generally collect when we do our genealogies. It includes the what, the why, and the how. So when we look at this, we want to consider a few things. We consider those general events and their effects. So we can consider things like diseases. Were they alive during Spanish flu, polio, or more recently, COVID, and how those experiences affected their lives? Were there important inventions that came into being during their lifespans? The automobile, the airplane, space travel, radio, TV, indoor plumbing, washing machines. How did those inventions affect their lives? Were there important military historical events? The Civil War, World War I, American Revolution, and how did those affect their lives? Did they fight? Were they in the military? And if so, what units were they in? Where were they based? And were there any significant battles that they may have fought in? We can look at their family life, things such as the average number of children, the average marriage age, life expectancy, and education all have effects on their lives. One of the things that's been coming up a lot in some of the things I've been listening to was the marriage age. If you were under 21 in many states, you had to have parental permission in order to get married during the 1800s, early 1900s. So that was an important thing. We can look at the economics of their life, their employment. Were they farmers? Were they industrial? Were they part of the WPA during the Great Depression? We can look at their salaries. Many of the census records and other records that we might find include their salary, their home values. Those sort of things give us an idea of what monetary values were during that period of their life, and the Great Depression or other major events such as that. We can look at migration patterns, the immigration patterns of groups of people, the causes of immigration, where they settled. We can also look at the role of religion in their lives. Were they Quakers, Amish, Catholic, Mormon? All of those sort of things would affect their lives also. Their language and ethnicity. Were they integrated into the communities around them, or did they settle in ethnic communities? Were they members of organizations such as fraternal, civic, or social organizations? We can learn about those by checking their obituaries or even reading the symbolism on their headstones. And then naming conventions. Were they named after their grandfather or grandmother? Did they reuse names of deceased children? What was the naming convention? And that'll help you understand relationships. So let's take an example such as immigration and look at how the social history affects that. Whoops. So there are many reasons people immigrated. A lot of times we look at the record and it says the family immigrated in 1832 or 1850 or 1880. Well, that's great. And then we also research, they immigrated into Castle Garden or Ellis Island or New Orleans. But that's only a part of the story. The other part, and maybe more importantly to their story, is why they immigrated. Was it crop failures or famine? Was it the search for land? Maybe it was jobs or economic opportunity. Maybe the taxes were going up in their country and they wanted to escape that. Or maybe they were involved in wars. It could possibly be because of religious freedom or racial and political persecution or a natural disaster. Each of those things has an effect on their life, and that part of their history is important to tell their story. Looking at immigration, we can look at people migrating to specific areas. Why did they settle where they settled? Was it because the climate and the land were similar to their homeland? Was it because others from their homeland had already settled in the area and they were joining their community? Was it because transportation routes led to an area? Were the rivers there, the railroads, the canals, or whatever it might be, important transportation routes that they settled in those areas because that's where they ended up being? So when we start to build the stories by including social history, we want to avoid fictionalizing. If you don't have the facts, you can infer or generalize based on the events, but make sure you state that. Don't say that your grandfather fought in World War II if all you have is his draft registration card. That doesn't mean he fought, it just means he registered. But you can say that it was likely that many of the people he knew ended up fighting during World War II and how that might have affected their community. And don't say that he drove a Model T Ford unless you have the evidence. You can say that the Model T Ford was invented during his life and that he likely experienced the change from horse and buggy to automotives. But, you don't want to make sure you're telling the truthful story. For example, one of the relatives that I recently researched, he had moved from a farm into a community and he established a livery stable there in the community. 3 years later, he had the first car dealership in that community. So he went from the livery stable business to selling automobiles, and that was, his life. And that automobile company's transferred down to his son and then his grandson, and it's still in the family. So I was able to tell that story, based on the facts. When you start gathering the social history and the information associated with your ancestors, you don't need to cover their entire life. You want to record these things. You want to produce stories so that your relatives, your family can learn about them. But, you want to consider in-depth narratives about a portion of their life, such as occupations, military, immigration, so on. And that's probably a lot better than, having a short, detailed story is better than having a long, rambling narrative. How many people are going to read a 15-page story about everything that happened in somebody's life compared to, here's a page about his occupation. Here's a page about his courtship with his wife. Here's a page about, his military history. You can break it up into bite-sized stories, and it makes it easier for people to read and more enjoyable to pass on the information. So let's talk about some of the sources that we may have to gather this information. One source is newspapers. When you look at newspapers, you need to understand the bias that may be presented in various newspapers. So a newspaper might be about a community, and if they were from a city, a town, or a rural community where that newspaper was produced, there may be a bias in how those stories are told. You'll also see the information about that community and about the local area, what was happening in those areas. It'll talk to you about storms, festivals, other events in those areas. And you may have to, focus your research on a small hometown newspaper to get the details of what was happening. But then you may want to go to a larger regional paper to see the historical context of an area. You can look in the newspapers and find the social pages. And these have some really great little tidbits about, who visited whom, where were they traveling, were they attending social events, card parties, birthdays, anniversaries, and who else was attending those events. This allows you to put them in place with their community. Now you have names of other people that they associate it with. And you can reach out, search for some of the information about those friends and associates that they may have had, and build some context into those stories with their information. You may find in their obituaries or marriage announcements lots of historical context within those. They're going to tell you things about what organizations they were, what occupations they had, who were their relatives, where did they live. And I enjoy reviewing the advertisements to understand their lives. You know, there may be different appliances that are advertised, you know, the first automatic washing machine, or the, you know, propane stoves, or automobiles, or whatever it might be that you find in these advertisements. You can put those in and utilize those as part of the story. And then you can also find county histories. Many libraries, Google Books, various different sources for county histories are available to you. And those county histories give you a view of the life in a particular county at a given time. They're filled with biographies. It lets you know who's doing what business, who's doing what families. So it builds a context of the community that they lived in. And you can also find information about the county history itself. So when was the county formed? When were the towns established? Did the capital of the county move from different locations, between different locations? What happens to the courthouse? Did they have a fire? Those things may be located in those county histories, and that'll help explain why you can or cannot find certain records while you're doing your research. And, you know, also look at the Family Search Wiki. You can pull up a county or a region and look to see what's written in the wiki about that region. For example, this is Auglaize County, Ohio. This is one of the areas that I research. And you see right in the middle of the page, it lists when major records started. Birth records started in 1867, marriage records 1848, and so on and so forth. So this gives you an idea about the history of the records based in those counties. But these wiki pages also tell you things like boundary changes, the populated places. They may provide a historical timeline. All of that information can help you build the story also. Of course, everybody uses Google. You know, Google has a lot of different places that you can search. So you can do the basic internet search on Google. But if you want to get into the books, you can go to books.google.com or Google Scholar. Google Scholar is usually scientific research materials, but it can be historical, it can be cultural. So they're published scholarly journals. You can go to Google Maps and you can see an area, see if the houses are still there, see if the grid pattern for the town is still there, see if, you know, you're using a plat map, you can see if that plat map relates back to the Google Maps. And one of the talks that I have, you know, shows how to overlay those so you can see those images of the paper maps versus the satellite maps. Google Patents gives you an idea, you know, what inventions were happening during a period of time. The Google Newspaper Archives is still out there and has a large collection of newspapers that you can use for free. I use Google Images all the time to, you know, get an image of maybe a person worked for a certain company. I can grab a picture of that company and what it looked like during that time frame. Or maybe somebody, the other day I was doing research on the Ohio Institution for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb. And I had 3 sisters who were all students at that school. And so I was able to go to Google Images. I put in the name of the school and I got the information. I got different pictures of the school during different times in its history. And I was able to utilize that for my description of their education. And then there's a page on Google, it's called Data Set Research. And you can put in things like 1950 census, and it will pull up statistical data on that census. And that might give you some information to utilize for your stories. So let's talk about building the stories. I'm going to start here with Google, and I'm going to build a story of Charles Bielefeld, one of my wife's ancestors. And one of the things I found on Google Scholar was this article from the Smithsonian Institute about a 19th century English paper mache chair. Now you're probably thinking, paper mache, that's what you make piñatas out of, or, those decorations. How do you make a chair out of paper mache? Well, this article talks about, the construction of this paper mache and how they're working on restoring it and so on. And at one of the footnotes talks about the Illustrated London News from August 6, 1853. And it talks about an entire village of several buildings, 10 houses made out of paper mache that were constructed by Charles Bielefeld and then shipped. He was constructed in London, England, and it was shipped to Australia to build a town. Well, that's really interesting. So what do I know about this? Well, I know in 1853, there's this note about a paper mache village that he constructed in Australia. Well, why is that important? In the 1850s, it was the Australian gold rush, and they had an influx of immigrants. So how do you build a quick village? You ship all the walls made out of paper mache to Australia, and they put all the walls together. This is one of your first manufactured homes, basically. And so I'm able to now tie this paper mache village constructed in 1853 to the 1850s gold rush and make some inferences based on the influx of immigrants moving to that area. Further researching Charles Bielefeld in Google Scholar, I get some information about a temporary House of Lords. And, well, why is there a temporary House of Lords? And what is he doing? Well, he's constructing all of the elaborate woodwork that you would see in the House of Lords, but he's doing it all out of paper mache because the House of Lords burned in 1834. And this article is from 1835. So now we can say, well, when the House of Lords burned in 1834, the temporary House of Lords was being constructed, and Charles Bielefeld was constructing part of the materials for that project. And then we find a lot more different articles about Charles Bielefeld and the different materials that he used and the different buildings that his paper mache was used in. And so I could take all of these and I could build a contextual history of the development of London and Charles Bielefeld's influence on that. And then here's a picture of the Pantheon Bazaar in 1845. And a lot of the elaborate woodwork that you see in here is faux woodwork, and it's paper mache. So, I can take that information and utilize these images and help build the contextual history and the social history of Charles Bielefeld. And then here we have his paper mache facility. This is his factory. It's at number 15 Wellington Street North in London. And I can go see, what's still there. And then I do have a couple pages out of his catalog, and you can see how elaborate his paper mache decorations were for the buildings that he was constructing. And then this is a picture of one of the buildings, the paper mache buildings that he put together in Australia. So I was able to find the floor plans and the images in Google Images to add to the story. So what story can we write about Charles Bielefeld? Well, we know he was a paper mache artist. And why was paper mache an important architectural development? It was cheap, it was easy to create, and it was fast to install. So you could create this thing very quickly and cheaply, as opposed to having a woodworker carve all of this material. We know that he worked on historically important buildings in London. And so we can add relevant details about St. James Palace, the House of Parliament, the Pantheon, and other buildings that he worked on, and add that context to it. And we know that he built a portable village in Australia. And why was this important? Well, the time frame that that was built was this large influx of immigrants and the gold rush. So let's build another story. Let's look at some newspaper articles, and we're going to build the story of my great-grandfather, Ray Westerheide. And we're going to focus in that 1920s to 30s time frame when prohibition was the law of the land. And as we go through and find these newspaper articles, we find that prohibition had an impact on many people, including my great-grandfather, since he was a booze runner, and he had several stills that he ran, very large-scale alcohol production during prohibition. And so I've got these stories about, him being the ringleader of an illicit alcohol ring, having to pay a fine of $750, being arrested with 500 gallons of illicit liquor, and so on and so forth. So I'm getting the context of what was happening during prohibition, and specifically what was happening to him. And so now we can take some of that information and start to build the story. We can talk about prohibition, and we can talk about what he was doing there. And I know that my great-grandfather had affiliations and supplied liquor to many of the well-known gangsters in the area. He delivered his alcohol from Chicago to Cincinnati, and that was his area to supply. And so, we all know the Chicago gangsters in that time period. And so my great-grandfather did have some associations with some of them. I know that he managed a Kroger grocery store. I can look in the advertisements, and it says, the Kroger grocery store's manager, Ray Westerheide. And I did find in one of the newspaper articles talking about how he used the sugar supplied to his grocery store to supply his stills for his alcohol production. And we can look through those newspapers, and we can tell what life was like in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, during Prohibition, in a small farming community, because we're looking at a local newspaper telling those stories. And so let's look at John Stevie, another one of my ancestors. And we're going to just pull off from his obituary. And when you look at his obituary, you can see that he was born in 1892. He was married in 1921, and he died at the age of 71. And looking through here, we see, all of his family members and so on. We can see that he was a World War I veteran. He fought in the Battle of Argonne-Verdun in France, and he took part in the March on the Rhine in the invasion of Germany. It also says that he served 2 terms on the New Bremen Board of Public Affairs. He was a charter member and past commander of the New Bremen American Legion. He was a member of the Holy Redeemer Church and the Holy Name Society. He was an owner of the Stevie Tin Shop in New Bremen for 41 years. So we're getting a lot of things, that build around him. But now we can start looking at some of these historical events. We can look at World War I. We can look at the Battle of Argonne-Verdun. We can look at the March on the Rhine. We can look at, the industries in that town and see how his tin shop might have been an important industry within the town. So when we're looking at World War I draft registration, he lists his occupation as sheet and metal worker. And in here, it has, do you claim exemptions from the draft? and he claimed an exemption. His exemption was his occupation as a sheet and metal worker, and he was the manager of that company. So why is that important? Why is his occupation as a sheet and metal worker important enough for him to say, I think I should be exempt from the draft? Well, what's one of the necessary things during war? It's metal products. And so now I can do a little bit of research and see how sheet metal was important in World War I and how that relates to him requesting an exemption from the draft. But that exemption didn't pan out for him. He was enlisted in the military. And so I now have his Veterans Administration Master Index. So this shows that he was in the military, and it provides his rank and his unit. So he was a corporal with Battery B, the 324th Field Artillery. So right now I'm thinking, oh, he's field artillery. This is the big guns, on the battlefield. So he must have seen some, important battles. He provides his service date as 2 October 1917 to 4 June 1919. So it's less than 2 years. And now I can look at that time period and what I can ask myself, what phase of the war was this? And where did that unit serve? So we know that he was discharged in 1919. We know he was enlisted in 1917. So we know that there was some training that went on for at least several months in 1917. And we can look at June of 1919 and see where that relates to the end of the war. What we find is that in this World War I transport record, he's leaving France. He left Brest, France, and arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, and in May of 1919. So he was on the ship Seattle, and we can see a list of all of the people that were on that ship with him and where they came from and so on, and where he was going. He was going to Camp Mills. So now we know that his unit had left France in May. He got back to the United States, and a couple of weeks later, he was discharged from the military. And I also was able to discover the history of the 324th Field Artillery. It's a book. It's on the Internet Archives website. Great place to find old books. And so what I can see here is, what happened. It tells me, they were in training at this location in Sherman, Ohio. Then they moved to Camp Mills in New York. And then they got on the steamship Lancashire in 1918, and they sailed over to England and got there June 12th, 1918. And then it arrived there, they disembarked to Liverpool, and then they went onto a train to Borden, England, and they spent a couple days there in camp, and so on and so forth. So I have very detailed description of where that unit was throughout that early part of their, before they even got onto the battlefield. And then I can get a little further in. It says the regiment proceeded by train to Sully, France, and marched overland to Bois-de-Hesse. Well, I don't know. How far is it from Sully, France to Bois-de-Hesse? I can put that into Google Maps and I can see how far that was that they marched. It says that they were there to reinforce the artillery brigade supporting the 91st Division on September 26th. And then on the 27th, they moved into position and so on. And the interesting thing about this is, as I'm looking through this, we have to remember this is World War I, so there were very few mechanized units. This unit actually had over 500 horses to help pull their supplies and their cannons. And so I can see that information as I read through this history of this unit, and I can see how many horses died and, when they were replaced and so on. And now that's giving me a context of the battlefield conditions that I can then utilize to tell the military history for John Stevie. I'm not writing his entire life history. I'm just talking about this short 18-month period when he was in World War I. So we can use the unit history to provide that context about the battles that he may have fought in. The historical records provide the details on those battles. And then we can read other histories to see what life was like on those battlefields. And we can make inferences to talk about what his experience might have been. And then the last of the stories I'm going to tell here is James Coker. And this is my wife's third great-grandfather, my son's fourth great-grandfather. And the reason why I'm talking about this is a project that my son used for his schoolwork. And this is like, 7th or 8th grade. So he took this social history and the context of James Coker's life and wrote a paper for his school assignment. So James fought in the Civil War. He was part of the Sumter Artillery from Georgia in the Confederate States of America. And so as he was doing his research, he built this outline, basically a timeline that he wanted to include in his story. The typical things that we do. When was he born? Who were his parents? Where did he live? When did he get married? How many children did he have? So that first part is your basic family history. The second part is the Civil War. So he started with Georgia secedes from the Union. It was the fifth state to do so. It did it in 1861, January 19th. Well, by July 6th, 1861, James had enlisted in the Confederate Army. So only 7 months after Georgia seceded from the Union, he had joined the Confederate Army, and he was 24 years old. He was assigned to Company A, the 11th Battalion, Georgia Volunteer Artillery, the Sumter Artillery, or the Sumter Battalion, and he was a private. He had two brothers that were also part of that unit, Isaac Coker and William Coker. He had cousins who were part of that unit. We're going through the muster rolls, and we're finding all of these. Most of them were privates, but one was a lieutenant and one was a sergeant. He had 4 brother-in-laws. Now, he wasn't married yet. I'm sorry, he was married in 1858. So these are his 4 brother-in-laws that were there. And then we have his uncles-in-laws and other relatives that we were able to find in that muster roll. Then we look at where did the Sumter Artillery, where did they fight? Well, they were sent to Richmond. A week after he enlisted, their unit was sent to Richmond, Virginia. Then they were sent to Manassas a week later. So it was 1 day after the Battle of Bull Run. So, they didn't make it to Bull Run. He's been in the military 2 weeks. He's already arriving at the Battle of Bull Run the day after that battle. A couple months later, he's at the Battle of Drainesville. Now I can talk about that. How many, they had 5 men that were killed, 13 men were wounded in their unit. And that was the most damage that their unit has sustained during any of the battles. So when you think of that, 13 wounded, 5 killed, okay, that's not too bad. And then it talks about different companies that were combined and merged and so on, and how that unit changed its structure over the period of the war. And then we go in, and they had a measles epidemic. 37 soldiers died during the measles epidemic in 1862. Okay, one of his brothers died during that epidemic. He contracted measles and died. Then they went to the Battle of Antietam, and for the South, it was the Battle of Sharpsburg. And so that was September 1862. And that was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. There were over 23,000 casualties. Well, where was this unit during that war? Well, we discovered that this unit was at Dunkers Church. Okay, and this will be important when I get to the next slide. And they were at Dunkers Church and Bloody Lane. So two very important portions of the Battle of Antietam. Then they went to the Battle of Fredericksburg, and then the Battle of Gettysburg, where they participated in artillery bombardments preceding Pickett's charge. And they provided ground cover for General Lee's retreat. And then they were cut off by the troops as they were retreating, and they spent 2 days skirmishing, trying to get back to the lines of the Confederate Army. They then went to Appomattox, and they were part of the General Reuben Walker's command there. They were unable to help General Lee. They were ordered to disband. They destroyed all of their cannons, and then they all marched southwards. So they were not there at Appomattox during the surrender. They all had left the battle and had started marching back to Georgia. So technically their unit never surrendered. And then we can go into the life after the Civil War. His marriage to Sarah Walters in 1866. Now, when I said the future brother-in-laws, Richard, Simeon, Seaborn, and Thomas Walters, those were Sarah's brothers. So, did he know the Walters family, or did he meet them during the war, became friends with them? We don't know that part of the story, but they fought together. And then, we get back into the regular family history component of this. When did he get married? Who was his wife? What was his children's name? When were they born? Where were they born? And where was he buried? So all of this information, we have the part 1 and part 3, which are your basic family history. And then we have that part 2, which is the social history. And we included some, my son included some photographs. So he's got James Franklin Coker. Beneath that are some of the Walters. This is Simeon and Seaborn Walters. To the right of James is the battlefield at Dunkers Church. And this is one of the most iconic images of that battle, the Battle of Antietam at Dunkers Church, where the Confederate artillery line is decimated and all laying dead on the field. That was where James Coker's unit was stationed that morning, and they had moved to a different location, and this other unit had replaced them, and that's the unit that was destroyed during the battle there. I get to visit Dunkers Church and Antietam battlefield once every couple of years for work purposes, and so I was able to take pictures of what the battlefield looks like today. And so you can see Dunkers Church with the monument of that line right there. And then there's a picture of Bloody Lane and, during the war, and then what it looks like today. And then the Confederate monuments to the Americus Georgia units right there in those images. So my son was able to incorporate those into his story. And then this is the story he wrote about James Franklin Coker. It's not an extensive story. It's a page and a half, but it tells that history. And the idea here was, the class assignment was to write something about the Civil War. And so by choosing an ancestor, he made that story about the Civil War more personal and more interesting to read. So I do a blog that's called ourancestries.blogspot.com. And on the Our Ancestries blog, I write stories about my ancestors. And I utilize different components of their histories and sort of expand on those and try to tell their stories, either their entire life stories or portions of their life stories, so that other people can find that information and learn about people they may be related to. So I'll stop there, and we can go and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I can try to answer those questions now. And I'm sure Bob will look to see if there's anything in the chat there. And
Yeah. I'm not seeing anything in chat, Miles.
Okay.
Does anybody have questions for Miles? Whoa, quiet group. Okay, perfect. One other thing I might mention is in the description for this presentation tonight at the granitefhc.com website, you'll find a link to a handout. And Miles, you want to talk about the handout for just a minute?
Yeah, so the handout is just basically an outline of some of the topics that were discussed tonight. And it just gives you an idea of what's, how to ask some of these questions and how to incorporate them into your family histories. So, take a look at it, write some notes, whatever it might be that makes it effective for you in order to use this technique to tell the stories, and incorporate the context with your ancestors.
And like I say, the handout link is posted currently on the presentation listing for tonight. And then when of course, that goes away after tonight. Class is over, and then I'll try to get it posted up with the video when the video gets posted in a few days as well. So, okay, anything from anybody else?
Well, I hope I gave people some ideas.
I got a few. Not only that, it's fascinating, especially about the paper mache stuff and whatnot. Who'd have known? Who'd have known? Crazy. Now we 3D print, but
that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Miles. We appreciate it as usual, and invite everyone to sign up for Roots Tech and come and visit all the wonderful things in the exhibit hall. The exhibit hall is free. So come there. So good evening, and we'll have you posted up here in a few days. Thank you, and good night, everyone.